Biden supports the Cuban dictatorship. Biden and the release of 553 political prisoners in Cuba. The recent decision by President Joe Biden to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism has sparked intense debate. This announcement raises questions about the effectiveness of the negotiations and their impact on the Cuban American community. The Cuban regime confirmed that it will release 553 sanctioned individuals, but clarified that this will be done gradually and under careful analysis, according to the modalities of its penal legislation. This decision has been perceived by many as a delaying tactic to maintain control over political opponents. The figure contrasts with the more than 1,000 people imprisoned for political reasons that human rights organizations have identified. Why did the negotiation only achieve partial release and not total pardon? Critics point out that these types of deals with the Cuban regime have historically not guaranteed long-term commitments, highlighting the lack of transparency in these efforts. Joe Biden's decision to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism has generated immediate reactions among anti-communist state senators and anti-Castro influencers, who have harshly criticized this measure, considering it a betrayal of democratic principles and an undeserved reward for the Cuban regime. Senators Maria Elvira Salazar, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Carlos Gimenez offer their statements after the controversial decision. They denounce the impact of this measure, which they consider a betrayal of democratic values and a blow to the exiled community in the United States. They analyze the possible consequences of this action and the message it sends to authoritarian regimes around the world. Well-known activists on social media and anti-Castro influencers have raised their voices to condemn the measure. Figures like Alexander Otaola and Rosa Maria Paya call this step a historic mistake, betrayal of the Cuban American community. They accuse Biden of ignoring the interests of Cuban exiles. They point out that this action legitimizes the repression against dissidents and undermines efforts to denounce human rights violations. Many interpret this move as a punishment to the Cuban American community for its support of Donald Trump.
It is a strategy to demobilize the Cuban diaspora, a key voice against communism.
Both groups agree that this act undermines efforts to promote democracy in Cuba and sends a dangerous message to other authoritarian regimes in the region. Biden has ignored the demands of Cuban exiles, strengthening the narrative of those who benefit from repression on the island. Biden's decision is being compared to Obama's move to eliminate the wet foot, dry foot policy in 2017. One day before leaving office. That action was criticized for being seen as a betrayal of Cuban Americans. Former President Donald Trump condemned this decision, calling it a sign of weakness. During his term, Trump reinstated tough sanctions against Cuba and reinforced policies to isolate the regime. Trump has described these actions by Biden as a betrayal. Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio, known for his strong stance against the Cuban regime, has harshly criticized Biden's move. Rubio called the decision an undeserved reward to the regime, arguing that there are no significant advances in human rights. According to Rubio, this measure sends a message of contempt to the Cuban American community. In addition to removing Cuba from the list of terrorist countries, the Biden administration temporarily suspended Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, weakening key restrictions on business with the Cuban government. These decisions, considered a significant relief for the regime, do not appear to be accompanied by substantial concessions from Cuba. Certification of the revocation of Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. President Biden's actions have drawn criticism from several fronts. The release of 553 political prisoners seems insufficient. These measures could strengthen the Cuban government without real improvements. The suspension of sanctions could be seen as a sign of weakness. Connections between the Biden administration and the Chinese regime have fueled the debate. Recent investigations point to possible financial ties between China and the Biden family, particularly through Hunter Biden. These connections have been the subject of legal charges and congressional hearings. They raise suspicions about China's influence on Biden's foreign policy. The role of Pope Francis and the Catholic Church has been key. The Holy See's mediation was decisive. The Cuban cardinal expressed his surprise. He was not aware of the negotiations. This calls into question the internal coordination. The Biden administration's decision to negotiate with the Cuban regime raises questions. Why were only 553 political prisoners released? What guarantees are there that the regime will comply? Who benefits from these decisions? The Cuban people are still waiting for real solutions.